July 11, 2018, the body of Richard Thornton, 45, was discovered in his luxury suite at the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. The tech CEO showed signs of poisoning and despite immediate medical attention, was pronounced dead at 11:42 p.m. His executive assistant Sofia Novak, 32, disappeared shortly after his collapse, prompting immediate suspicion. As authorities launched their investigation, they uncovered a disturbing story of obsession, deception, and vengeance spanning over a decade. The events that led to Thornton's death had begun years earlier, when a traumatic childhood connection forged an unbreakable and ultimately deadly bond between victim and killer, one that Thornton himself never recognized. The desert air in Las Vegas was dry and hot, the temperatures still hovering around 95 degrees despite the late evening hour when the first responders rushed through the ornate lobby of the Bellagio. The hotel, known for its luxury and opulence, had always been a gathering place for the wealthy and successful, a glittering oasis where Fortune 500 companies held their executive retreats away from prying eyes. But on July 11, 2018, that exclusive sanctuary was shattered. At 10:13 p.m., a frantic call came from the Imperial Ballroom, where Horizon Technologies was hosting their annual leadership summit. "He's not breathing right, something's wrong," the caller had gasped into the phone. Mr. Thornton just collapsed in the middle of his speech. The Bellagio's medical team arrived within minutes, finding chaos in the ballroom. Nearly 100 executives in formal attire stood in clusters, their faces pale with shock as they watched their CEO convulse on the stage, his body arching unnaturally, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. EMTs transferred Thornton to his suite rather than trying to move him through the crowded casino floor to an ambulance. Suite 812, the chairman's suite, quickly transformed from a symbol of luxury to a desperate medical ward. Crystal glasses and champagne bottles still sat on the marble bar counter from the private reception earlier that evening. The air smelled of expensive cologne and the faint metallic scent of fear as medical teams worked frantically to save the tech mogul's life. His skin had taken on a bluish tint, his breathing becoming increasingly labored despite the oxygen mask strapped to his face. Hotel security reviewed camera footage even before the police arrived, noting with interest that Sofia Novak, Thornton's executive assistant of 3 years, had been seen entering his suite at 9:27 p.m., carrying what appeared to be documents. She exited at 9:41 p.m., her expression calm but her movements hurried. She took the elevator to the hotel lobby and walked directly to the exit, pulling a small suitcase that hadn't been visible when she entered the hotel that morning. No one thought to stop her. She was, after all, Thornton's trusted right hand, the gatekeeper to one of tech's most powerful figures. By the time Detective Marcus Rivera and his partner Detective Elaine Chen arrived at 11:03 p.m., the hotel's security team had already compiled preliminary footage. The detectives barely had time to examine the suite before the paramedics called Thornton's time of death, 11:42 p.m. The room fell silent as the sheet was pulled over his face. For a moment, the only sound was the muted chime of slot machines filtering up from the casino 16 floors below, a surreal counterpoint to the grim scene in the luxury suite. As Rivera surveyed the room, his gaze fell on a half-empty glass of scotch beside Thornton's laptop. "No one touches that," he said quietly, already suspecting what lab tests would later confirm. Richard Thornton, the 45-year-old wunderkind who had built Horizon Technologies into a $4.7 billion empire, had been poisoned in the middle of his crowning achievement, the announcement of a revolutionary new technology platform that would have cemented his legacy as one of tech's greatest innovators. Detective Rivera began methodically working the scene while his partner coordinated with hotel security. Suite 812 remained largely undisturbed, the king-sized bed still made, the bathroom counter lined with expensive toiletries, a laptop open on the desk beside a leather portfolio embossed with the Horizon Technologies logo. Nothing seemed out of place except for the victim himself, still lying where he had collapsed after the paramedics had moved him from the ballroom. Security has confirmed Ms. Novak left the premises at 9:46 p.m., Detective Chen reported, sliding her phone into her jacket pocket. She got into a taxi outside the main entrance. "They're trying to track where it went." She moved to the minibar, noting several bottles had been opened. Initial witness statements say Thornton seemed fine during dinner. First signs of distress didn't appear until he was about 15 minutes into his keynote address. Rivera carefully examined the Scotch glass, noting a faint smudge of lipstick on the rim, a deep red that seemed at odds with Thornton's persona. "We need to know if he was seeing anyone," he said, photographing the glass from multiple angles before bagging it as evidence. "And I need a list of everyone with access to this room." By dawn, the detectives had interviewed 17 executives who had attended the retreat. All told similar stories. Thornton had been in excellent spirits, excited about unveiling the company's new platform. None had noticed anything unusual about Sophia's behavior, though several mentioned she seemed more attentive than usual to Thornton throughout the day. "She's worked for him for 3 years," said James Morris, Horizon's chief financial officer, his face haggard from shock and lack of sleep. "Completely devoted to her job. I never saw her make a single mistake." He paused, rubbing his temples. "But now that you mention it, there was something odd yesterday." Richard received a package, a small gift box. Sophia practically snatched it out of his hands, insisting she needed to vet it. "Security protocols," she said. But Richard just laughed it off. The hotel's housekeeping staff provided another crucial detail. Ms. Novak requested special turn-down service for Mr. Thornton's suite, the supervisor explained. She specified it should be done before 7 p.m., saying he had a strict pre-speech ritual and didn't want to be disturbed after that time. This had given Sophia an exclusive window to access the suite without interruption. At 10:17 a.m. on July 12th, the preliminary toxicology report arrived. Richard Thornton had died from acute thallium poisoning, a substance once known as the poisoner's poison, due to its colorless, odorless nature and deadly efficiency. It was typically used in rat poison and insecticides, but had been banned in the US for decades. Thallium causes a painful death, attacking the nervous system and organs, exactly matching Thornton's symptoms. A search of Sophia Novak's hotel room revealed nothing immediately suspicious. Her belongings were neatly packed, her toiletries arranged with almost obsessive precision. But beneath the mattress, detectives found a burner phone and a small notebook filled with detailed observations about Thornton's daily routine, preferences, and behaviors. The final page contained a single sentence: "He still doesn't remember me." As Rivera flipped through the notebook, an alert came through on his phone. Facial recognition from airport security had flagged Sophia Novak attempting to board a flight to Mexico City. The photo showed a woman with newly dyed blonde hair and glasses, but the system had caught the match nonetheless. Local police apprehended her at the gate, finding in her possession a passport under the name Elena Vasquez and approximately $45,000 in cash. But the most damning evidence came when detectives searched Sophia's apartment in San Francisco. Hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box, they found an old photograph. A young Richard Thornton, perhaps 17 years old, standing with an arm around a much younger girl in front of what appeared to be a rural home. On the back was written, "The day before everything changed. Never forget." The discovery of the photograph was a breakthrough that changed the entire direction of the investigation. "We need to dig deeper into both their backgrounds," Rivera instructed his team. "I want everything: birth records, school records, family histories. Something connects these two from long before Horizon Technologies." Digital forensics revealed Sophia had maintained multiple social media accounts under different names, all dedicated to following Thornton's career. Her primary laptop contained a hidden folder with thousands of photos of him spanning nearly 15 years, at conferences, business meetings, charity events, and even through telephoto lenses capturing him in private moments on his lakeside property in Tahoe. "This goes beyond workplace obsession," Chin remarked as they scrolled through the images. "These photos start before she even worked for him. Look at the timestamps. Some of these go back to his early startup days. She's been stalking him for over a decade." Most disturbing was a digital diary meticulously documenting Sophia's thoughts. The earliest entry was dated August 2008, nearly 10 years prior. "Saw him today at the TechCrunch conference. He didn't recognize me. How could he forget? I was right there. I saw everything." Phone records showed Sophia had applied for positions at every company Thornton worked for since 2009, finally succeeding in getting hired at Horizon Technologies in 2015. Her references and employment history appeared impeccable, too perfect in fact. When detectives contacted her previous employers, none could provide substantive details about her work, suggesting falsified employment records. "We've got a problem," said a researcher from the records department, walking into Rivera's office on the third day of the investigation. Sophia Novak doesn't exist, at least not before 2008. Her social security number was issued that year, her driver's license is from 2008, and there's no record of her attending the universities listed on her resume. The final piece fell into place when Rivera received a call from a detective in rural Pennsylvania. "We found a match on your victim from an old case," the officer explained. In 1988, a family named Kozlov was killed in a home invasion in Lancaster County. The parents and their 6-year-old daughter were murdered, but their 10-year-old daughter survived by hiding in a closet. The prime suspect was a 17-year-old neighbor boy who disappeared the night of the murders and was never found. He paused. "The boy's name was Richard Thompson. We believe he changed it to Thornton a few years later." Rivera looked at the photo again, suddenly understanding. The young girl standing next to teenage Richard wasn't Sophia. It was the sister of the girl who would later become Sophia Novak. The survivor of the massacre had spent a decade tracking down the person she believed had murdered her family. In the quiet farming community of Riverdale, Pennsylvania, the summer of 1988 had been unusually hot and dry. The Kozlov family, immigrants from Russia who had arrived 5 years earlier, owned a modest 2-story farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Anatoly and Irina Kozlov were hardworking people who had built a respectable life for their daughters, 10-year-old Natasha and 6-year-old Katya. Living next door was the Thompson family, whose teenage son Richard had developed a reputation for brilliance and volatility. At 17, Richard was already taking college-level computer courses and had been accepted to MIT on a full scholarship. But behind his academic success lay a troubled home life. His father, an alcoholic with a violent temper, frequently took out his frustrations on Richard and his mother. The Kozlovs often invited Richard over for dinner, offering him respite from his home situation. Anatoly, recognizing the boy's exceptional intelligence, encouraged his interest in computers, even buying him programming books. Richard became something of an older brother to Natasha, teaching her simple coding and sharing his dreams of creating technology that would change the world. "I'll build something incredible one day," he told her during one of their afternoon lessons at the Kozlovs' kitchen table. "Something that makes people's lives better. And I'll never forget who believed in me first." He had snapped the photo that would later be found in Sophia's apartment just one day before tragedy struck, a memento of the family that had shown him kindness. On July 24, 1988, the Kozlov family was attacked in their home. Official reports indicated that someone broke in during the night, killed Anatoly and Irina with a hunting knife, and then murdered young Katya. Only Natasha survived, hiding in a hall closet where she witnessed shadows of the violence through the slats in the door. When police arrived the next morning, called by a neighbor who noticed the front door standing open, they found the child in a state of catatonic shock, unable to speak. The primary suspect was Richard Thompson, who had disappeared the same night. His father claimed Richard had stolen $300 from his wallet before leaving. Police found blood-stained sneakers in Richard's bedroom closet, matching the blood type of the Kozlov family. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but Richard had vanished. What authorities didn't know then was that Richard had indeed fled, not out of guilt, but fear. Earlier that evening, he had gone to the Kozlov home to say goodbye before leaving for MIT, only to discover the aftermath of the brutal attack. Panicking and knowing his troubled history with the law would make him the prime suspect, he ran, using the money he'd been saving for college to establish a new identity. Natasha Kozlov, orphaned and traumatized, entered the foster care system. For years, she spoke to no one about what she had seen that night. Her court-appointed therapist noted in her files, "Patient continues to draw pictures of a tall figure with a knife, but refuses to identify who this represents." Her silence appears to be a trauma response rather than an inability to recall. At 18, Natasha aged out of the system and disappeared. Using skills learned from her time with Richard, she hacked government databases to create a new identity. Sofia Novak was born. The irony that she used techniques taught by the very person she believed had destroyed her family was not lost on her. It fueled her determination. For years, she hunted for traces of Richard Thompson, searching news articles and technology publications. When facial recognition software became available, she spent thousands of dollars on access to private databases, finally getting a match in 2008. Richard Thompson was now Richard Thornton, a rising star in Silicon Valley who had founded his first successful startup after graduating from Stanford. 10 years of searching, she wrote in her diary. I finally found him. He built his life on the foundation of my family's blood. While I was being shuttled between foster homes, learning to sleep with my eyes open, he was attending Stanford and building his first million-dollar company. Sofia crafted a meticulous plan. Rather than simple revenge, she wanted Thornton to know who was punishing him and why. She enrolled in business courses, studied his management style, and transformed herself into exactly the kind of assistant he would value. After several failed attempts to get hired at his previous companies, she finally secured a position at Horizon Technologies in 2015. For 3 years, she worked tirelessly as Richard's executive assistant, becoming indispensable to him. She managed his schedule with flawless efficiency, anticipated his needs before he expressed them, and protected him from distractions with fierce loyalty. Colleagues noted their close professional relationship, occasionally wondering if there might be more between them, but both maintained strictly professional boundaries. What no one realized was that Sofia was studying Richard, looking for any sign that he remembered the Kozlov family, any indication of remorse for what she believed he had done. She searched his office late at night, examined his personal files, and even accessed his therapy records, where she discovered he had been diagnosed with PTSD stemming from childhood trauma, but the records never specified the nature of that trauma. On the surface, Richard Thornton appeared to be a dedicated leader with a passion for innovation. Behind closed doors, however, he struggled with insomnia and panic attacks. He donated generously to children's charities but avoided personal relationships, never marrying or having children of his own. The success that made him a technology icon seemed to bring him little personal joy. He lives like a man haunted, Sofia wrote in her diary. But not haunted enough. He doesn't wake screaming like I still do. He hasn't earned his success. He stole it from the future my parents would have built for me and Katia. The perfect opportunity for her revenge emerged when Richard announced the annual leadership retreat at the Bellagio. The high-profile event would serve as the backdrop for unveiling Horizon's groundbreaking new platform, and for Sofia's meticulously planned retribution, 30 years in the making. July 10, 2018, 10 a.m. The Bellagio's chairman's suite welcomed Richard Thornton with its signature opulence, marble floors, panoramic views of the Las Vegas Strip, and the understated luxury that had made it a favorite among tech elites. Richard dropped his leather weekender bag by the bed, rolling his shoulders to release the tension from the flight. The team arrives at 3, Sofia said, efficiently unpacking his garment bag. She hung his custom-tailored suits in the closet with practiced precision. I've scheduled a brief meeting with marketing at 4, followed by drinks with the board at 6. Your keynote prep is at 9 tomorrow morning. Richard nodded absently, scanning his email on his phone. Perfect as always, Sofia. What would I do without you? He didn't notice the slight tightening around her eyes at the casual compliment. Crash and burn, probably, she replied with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. The gift package for the executive team is ready. I've added the custom watches as you requested. At 12:30 p.m., Sofia met with the hotel's catering manager, reviewing every aspect of the next evening's dinner. Mr. Thornton is allergic to shellfish, she reminded him, though Richard had no such allergy. And he prefers Macallan 18 for his scotch. Make sure it's available at the private bar in his suite. By 3:15 p.m., Horizon Technologies' executive team had gathered in the conference room. Richard moved among them with easy confidence, shaking hands and clapping shoulders. Sofia observed from the periphery, noting how naturally leadership came to him, How different from the frightened teenager she believed had fled a murder scene 3 decades earlier. Tomorrow night, Richard announced to his leadership team, we make history. 5 years of development, 2 years in stealth mode, and finally we unveil Nexus to the world. His eyes gleamed with genuine excitement. This platform will revolutionize how AI interfaces with predictive analytics. The applications for healthcare alone will change millions of lives. At 7:30 p.m., during the board dinner, Richard's phone buzzed with a text. Sophia watched him check it, saw his face momentarily freeze before he excused himself from the table. She followed at a discreet distance as he took the call in a quiet alcove off the main restaurant. How did you get this number? Richard's voice was low, tense. No, you must be mistaken. That case was closed decades ago. I don't know what you're talking about. He ended the call abruptly, his hand trembling slightly as he pocketed his phone. When Sophia approached, he startled. Everything all right, Richard? She asked, the picture of professional concern. Fine, he said curtly. Just an unwelcome blast from the past. Nothing to worry about. But as they returned to the dinner, his earlier enthusiasm had dimmed noticeably. Later that night, at 11:42 p.m., exactly 24 hours before he would be pronounced dead, Richard sat alone in his suite, drinking scotch and staring at his laptop. Sophia had arranged a video call with a detective in Pennsylvania, posing as a journalist researching cold cases. The detective had mentioned the Kozlov murders, not realizing he was speaking to the long-missing suspect and the surviving victim's sister. Never solved officially, the detective had said. But the evidence against the Thompson kid was pretty compelling. Bloody shoe prints matched his size, and he ran the same night. Classic guilty behavior. After the call ended, Richard sat motionless, memories he had suppressed for years flooding back. Sophia had been watching him through the suite's connected rooms, studying his reaction. She saw him open his laptop and search for Kozlov Murders 1988, then Natasha Kozlov Survivor. Finding little, he typed Richard Thompson, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and stared at the old newspaper article that appeared, showing his teenage face under the headline, Local Teen Sought in Triple Homicide. July 11, 2018, 7:15 a.m. Sophia entered Richard's suite with his morning coffee. Dark circles under his eyes suggested a sleepless night. Good morning, she said brightly. Your breakfast will be up in 20 minutes. The tech team needs you to review the demo one final time before tonight. Richard nodded absently, accepting the coffee. Sophia, he said suddenly, how long have you worked for me? 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, she answered without hesitation. And in all that time, I've never really asked about your background, have I? His eyes searched her face. Where did you say you grew up? For a fraction of a second, Sophia's composure wavered. Oregon, she said smoothly. Very boring. Nothing like your Pennsylvania roots. She emphasized the state name slightly, watching for his reaction. Richard's hand froze halfway to his mouth, coffee cup suspended. I don't believe I ever mentioned Pennsylvania to you. Of course you did, she replied. During the charity gala last year. You mentioned growing up near Lancaster. She changed the subject quickly. Your suit for tonight has been pressed. The blue tie, I think, it photographs better under stage lighting. At 2:30 p.m., as final preparations for the evening's presentation were underway, a small package arrived for Richard. The hotel concierge delivered it personally, a nondescript box with a handwritten card. Sophia intercepted it as Richard was speaking with his CTO. I'll need to check this before you open it, she said when he returned. Security protocols. Richard laughed. You're always so cautious, Sophia. It's probably just another congratulatory gift from an investor. But he allowed her to take the package, not seeing her slip the card into her pocket as she walked away. In the privacy of her own room, Sophia opened the small box to find an old Russian nesting doll, identical to one that had sat on the Kozlov family's mantle 30 years earlier. The card read simply, I know who you are, Natasha, and I know what you're planning. We need to talk. Her hands shaking with rage and shock, Sophia stared at the doll. Someone had discovered her true identity, Richard himself, based on the initial. After all these years of careful planning, she couldn't allow interference. The timeline would need to accelerate. At 6:15 p.m., the executive dinner began in the private dining room. Sophia circulated among the guests, efficient and invisible as always. At 7:03 p.m., she slipped away to Richard's suite with the master keycard she'd been entrusted with years ago. From her purse, she removed a small vial containing a colorless, odorless liquid, thallium sulfate, ordered from an overseas chemical supply company under a false name months earlier. With practiced hands, she added 6 drops to the bottle of Macallan 18 that waited on his bar. Enough to kill, but slow-acting enough that symptoms would develop gradually. The dosage was carefully calculated to ensure he would collapse during his keynote speech, when all eyes would be on him, creating maximum public impact for Horizon Technologies. At 7:22 p.m., she returned to the dinner, sliding back into her role seamlessly. Richard was in his element, energized by the upcoming announcement, oblivious to what awaited him. After dinner, at 8:45 p.m., he returned to his suite to review his presentation one final time. "Would you like a drink while you work?" Sophia asked, already moving toward the bar. "Just a small one," Richard agreed, loosening his tie. "Nerves, I suppose, though I've done this 100 times." Sophia poured the scotch from the poison bottle, watching as he took the first sip. "Everything will go perfectly tonight," she assured him. "You've worked toward this for years." At 9:27 p.m., Sophia entered Richard's suite one last time, bringing the final version of his speech. He was already showing the first subtle signs of thallium poisoning. A slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, a barely perceptible tremor in his hands. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, feigning concern. "Just tired," he replied. "And a strange metallic taste in my mouth. Maybe I'm coming down with something." "You should take some antacids," she suggested helpfully. "Probably just nerves and rich food." She placed a small packet of pills on his desk, not antacids, but calcium supplements that would accelerate thallium absorption. As she turned to leave, Richard called her name. "Sophia? Or should I say Natasha?" She froze, her hand on the doorknob. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "I received a call yesterday from a detective who reopened the Kozlov case. DNA evidence from under your father's fingernails. They matched it to mine through one of those ancestry websites my cousin used." He sighed heavily. "I didn't kill your family, Natasha. I tried to save them." Sophia turned slowly. "Don't lie to me. Not after all this time." "I arrived after it happened," Richard continued, his voice strained. "Your father had called me earlier, worried about threats he'd received. When I got there, I found them already dead, except you. You were hiding in the closet. I saw you, tried to reach for you, but you screamed. I heard sirens and panicked. With my history of fights with my father, I knew they'd blame me." His eyes met hers. "I've spent 30 years haunted by that night, by not staying to protect you." "Stop," Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. "My sister was 6 years old." "I know," he said softly. "I've donated to children's charities in her name every year. I kept the article about the murders all this time." He pulled an old, folded newspaper clipping from his wallet, worn thin with age. "I never forgot them, or when you applied to work for me, I thought it was a strange coincidence at first. The resemblance was there, but you had a different name." Sophia felt the carefully constructed vengeance of a decade beginning to crumble. "If you recognized me, why hire me? Why keep me close?" "Because I owed you a life," he said simply. "The career, the opportunities, the future that were stolen from you. I thought maybe I could give some of that back. I never knew you blamed me." As the poison continued its work through his system, Richard's breathing became more labored. The detective found evidence identifying the real killer, a business partner of your father's who owed him money. They're exhuming his body now to confirm the DNA match. He slid his phone toward her, showing an email from the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. At 9:41 p.m., Sophia left Suite 812 for the last time, her mind in turmoil. The carefully constructed narrative that had sustained her for decades was collapsing. Behind her, Richard was already feeling the more severe effects of the poison, but continued preparing for his speech, unaware that he would never finish delivering it. At 10:13 p.m., during his keynote address, Richard Thornton collapsed on stage, the poison finally overwhelming his system. In the chaos that followed, Sofia Novak walked out of the Bellagio into the hot Las Vegas night, her revenge complete but her certainty shattered. The trial of Sofia Novak became a national sensation, combining elements of true crime, corporate intrigue, and psychological drama that captivated the public imagination. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. The poison purchase traced to an alias she had used, her meticulously documented stalking, and the damning contents of her diary outlining her plans for revenge. What complicated the case, and fascinated the media, was the revelation of the true killer of the Kozlov family. DNA evidence confirmed that Anatoly Kozlov's former business partner, Gregory Mercer, had committed the murders over a financial dispute. Mercer had died in 2006, never facing justice for his crimes. The evidence exonerated Richard Thompson completely, revealing that the teenage boy had indeed arrived after the killings, as he had told Sofia in their final conversation. The tragedy here is doubled, the prosecutor stated in her opening argument. First, when a young girl lost her family and fixated on the wrong person for revenge. Second, when that misplaced vengeance took the life of an innocent man who had actually tried to help her. Sofia's defense team pursued an insanity plea, arguing that the childhood trauma had created a delusional fixation. They presented evidence of her fractured foster care experience, the lack of proper psychological treatment after the murders, and expert testimony about the impact of such trauma on a developing brain. This isn't a simple case of premeditated murder, her attorney argued. This is what happens when our system fails a traumatized child and allows vengeance to fester into psychosis. The trial revealed aspects of Richard Thornton that surprised even those closest to him. His personal records, introduced as evidence, showed annual donations to trauma centers for children. His will, updated just months before his death, established a substantial foundation for supporting foster children, with Sofia Novak named as its director. He knew who she was, testified James Morris, Horizon's CFO. He mentioned once that he felt responsible for her in some way, though he never explained why. I assumed they had some past connection from another company. The most compelling testimony came from Richard's therapist, who received posthumous permission to reveal their sessions. Richard suffered from survivor's guilt his entire adult life, she explained. He believed he could have saved the Kozlov family if he'd arrived earlier, or if he'd taken Natasha with him when he fled. The night before his death, he called me in distress, saying he had finally found Natasha and needed to make things right. During the trial, forensic analysis of Richard's laptop revealed his final actions. In the hours before his death, he had drafted emails to his lawyers, instructing them to revise his will to include a trust for Sofia/Natasha. He had also written a letter addressed to her, explaining everything he remembered about that night in 1988 and asking for forgiveness, not for killing her family, but for leaving her behind. When Sofia took the stand in her own defense, her composed facade had crumbled. "I spent 20 years hating a ghost," she testified, her voice barely audible. "When I finally found him, I spent 3 more years planning his death. It never occurred to me that I could be wrong." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "The worst part is knowing that while I was plotting to destroy him, he was trying to save me, again." The jury deliberated for 4 days before finding Sofia Novak guilty of first-degree murder, but with a recommendation for mental health treatment as part of her sentence. The judge, acknowledging the exceptional circumstances, sentenced her to 25 years to life, with mandatory psychiatric care. Public reaction to the case was deeply divided. Some saw Sofia as a tragic figure, warped by trauma and failed by the system. Others viewed her as a calculating killer who had manipulated her way into a position of trust to execute a cold-blooded murder. The tech community mourned Richard Thornton as a visionary whose life had been cut short on the verge of his greatest achievement. Horizon Technologies struggled in the aftermath, its stock plummeting 40% in the month following Thornton's death. The Nexus platform, which had been set to revolutionize AI applications in healthcare, was delayed indefinitely. Many of the executives who had witnessed their CEO's collapse left the company, unable to shake the memory of that night. 6 months after the trial, a package arrived at the women's correctional facility where Sofia was serving her sentence. Inside was the Russian nesting doll that had been sent to Richard the day of his death, along with a note from Detective Rivera, found among Mr. Thornton's possessions. Analysis confirmed it's the original from your childhood home. Thought you should have it. Psychiatric reports noted a significant shift in Sofia's mental state after receiving the doll. Patient has begun to engage meaningfully with therapy, her doctor noted. She expresses deep remorse and appears to be reconstructing her understanding of past events. The obsessive fixation on Richard Thornton has transformed into a more complex grief process, mourning both her family and the man she wrongfully killed. In a cruel twist of fate, the foundation Richard had established to help trauma survivors was eventually funded by the posthumous success of his final project. 18 months after his death, Horizon Technologies released a scaled-down version of the Nexus platform. As specified in his will, 30% of the profits went to the foundation, which focused specifically on providing long-term therapeutic support for children who had witnessed violent crimes. The first facility opened by the foundation was located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, less than a mile from where the Kozlov family had lived. It was named Kadia's Place, after Sofia's younger sister. The dedication plaque bore a quote from Richard Thornton's undelivered keynote speech, found on his laptop after his death. Our greatest innovations mean nothing if we cannot heal the wounds of our past. Technology should serve humanity's deepest needs, for connection, for understanding, and ultimately, for redemption. In her prison cell, Sofia kept the Russian nesting doll on the small shelf allowed for personal items. Inside the smallest doll, unseen by anyone, she had placed the torn corner of the photograph found in her apartment. The image of a teenage Richard with his arm around her sister, a fragment of happiness preserved from before her world collapsed and vengeance became her only purpose. The Nevada Women's Correctional Center maintained a small garden program where inmates could grow vegetables and flowering plants in the otherwise barren desert environment. On a scorching July morning in 2023, exactly 5 years after Richard Thornton's death, Sofia Novak knelt in the dry soil, carefully transplanting marigold seedlings. At 37, her once pristine appearance had transformed. The designer clothes had been replaced by prison-issued garments, her previously immaculate nails were short and practical, and strands of premature gray streaked her dark hair. Yet the most profound changes weren't visible. The prison psychiatrist had noted in her file, patient has progressed from denial to anger to a complex acceptance. The obsessive personality traits remain but have been redirected toward more constructive outlets. Mail call, Novak, announced a guard, approaching the garden fence. She handed over a large manila envelope bearing the Horizon Technologies logo. Inside her cell, Sofia carefully opened the envelope. It contained a letter from James Morris, now CEO of Horizon, along with several newspaper clippings and a small flash drive, pre-approved by prison authorities. The Nexus platform has finally achieved what Richard envisioned, Morris wrote. Last month, it helped identify a previously undetectable biomarker for early-stage pancreatic cancer. Early detection trials show a 62% increase in survival rates. I thought you should know that his work, the work you witnessed developing, is saving lives. The Richard Thornton Foundation has now opened its 5th trauma center. The board voted unanimously to allow your remote participation in the Foundation's advisory committee, should you wish to contribute your unique perspective on childhood trauma interventions. The flash drive contained video of the newest trauma center's opening ceremony. Sofia watched as children played in a brightly colored therapy room named the Natasha Kozlov Healing Space, a recognition of her childhood identity that brought tears to her eyes. Detective Rivera had retired the previous year but maintained correspondence with Sofia as part of his volunteer work with the Restorative Justice Program. His latest letter, also in the mail delivery, was characteristically direct. The Lancaster County Sheriff's Department has officially closed the Kozlov family murder case. Gregory Mercer's DNA has been confirmed from multiple sources. Richard Thompson's name has been fully cleared in public record. I thought you'd want to know. That evening, during her weekly group therapy session, Sophia spoke more openly than ever before. For 30 years, I defined myself by a single night, by what was taken from me and by my determination to find justice. I built an entire identity around vengeance. She paused, looking at the other women in the circle. I was so certain, so absolutely convinced of my righteousness, that I never questioned my own narrative. The thought that I could be wrong never occurred to me. The most difficult thing to accept isn't my imprisonment, she continued. It's knowing that I killed the one person who actually tried to help me, who remembered me and carried his own guilt all those years. I destroyed the man who, in his own way, had been as haunted by that night as I was. Her therapist nodded encouragingly. And what are you working on now, in terms of moving forward? Sophia looked down at her hands. Learning to live with being both a victim and a perpetrator. Finding purpose beyond revenge. She took a deep breath. I've been corresponding with the Foundation's child psychologists, sharing my experience from both sides, as a traumatized child and as someone who let that trauma warp into something destructive. If my story can help even one child find a healthier path, maybe that's a form of atonement. Later that night, alone in her cell, Sophia opened the Russian nesting doll, her one permitted keepsake, and removed the fragment of the old photograph. For years, she had avoided looking at Richard's teenage face, finding it too painful. Now, she studied it carefully, noting the kindness in his eyes that she had never allowed herself to see before. She took out the journal she had been encouraged to keep as part of her therapy. Unlike her previous obsessive documentation of Richard's movements, this journal focused inward. On the anniversary of his death, she wrote, I spent half my life planning the perfect revenge against the wrong person. I wonder now what might have happened if I had approached Richard with questions instead of certainty, with openness instead of calculation. There might have been healing for both of us. The ultimate irony is that in death, he accomplished what he couldn't in life. He gave me back my true identity. Not Sophia Novak, the persona I created to execute my revenge, but Natasha Kozlov, the 10-year-old girl who witnessed horror and survived. For the first time since that night in 1988, I am trying to live as my authentic self, however flawed and damaged. Richard's last gift to me was shattering my certainty, forcing me to confront the possibility that the narrative I had constructed and clung to for decades might be wrong. In that painful space of doubt, I found something unexpected, the beginning of freedom. While Sophia served her sentence, the technology world continued to evolve around the innovations Richard Thornton had pioneered. Nexus, finally launched 2 years after his death, became the foundation for a new generation of medical diagnostic tools. By 2023, the platform had expanded beyond its original scope, creating an AI framework that could detect patterns across seemingly unrelated medical data. Thornton's vision was always larger than people realized, explained Dr. Elena Vasquez, Horizon's new Chief Innovation Officer, in a TED Talk that went viral. He wasn't just building better software, he was creating a new paradigm for how machines could augment human insight. The tragedy is that he never saw its full implementation. The Richard Thornton Foundation grew to become one of the most significant resources for childhood trauma research and treatment in the country. Its innovative approach, combining cutting-edge neuroscience with compassionate therapeutic interventions, was revolutionizing how the medical community understood and treated childhood PTSD. James Morris often reflected on the cruel paradox at the heart of Horizon's success, that their greatest achievements had emerged from their greatest tragedy. Richard always said that technology should serve humanity's deepest needs, he told a journalist on the 5th anniversary of Thornton's death. What he couldn't have foreseen was how his own life and death would create the circumstances for that vision to be realized. #the investigation team. Detective Marcus Rivera retired from the Las Vegas Police Department in 2022 after a distinguished 30-year career. The Thornton case remained one of his most memorable, not just for its high-profile nature but for the psychological complexity it presented. In most murder cases, the lines between victim and perpetrator are relatively clear. he explained to recruits during his final lecture at the police academy. But occasionally, you encounter situations where those boundaries blur. The Thornton Novak case taught me that people can be both victim and villain in their own stories, and that understanding the why is sometimes as important as proving the who. His partner, Detective Elaine Chin, was promoted to head of the Major Crimes Division, where she specialized in cases involving complex psychological elements. She occasionally used the Thornton case as a teaching tool, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond the obvious. What appeared at first to be a simple case of workplace poisoning revealed itself as something far more intricate, she would tell new detectives. It spanned decades, involved mistaken identity, trauma, and the human capacity for both extraordinary compassion and devastating vengeance. It reminds us to question our first assumptions and to look for the deeper narrative. In July 2028, 10 years after Richard Thornton's death, James Morris received a package from Detective Rivera, who had continued investigating aspects of the case even in retirement. The package contained a USB drive with a video file and a handwritten note. Found this in the digital archives of the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. It was part of evidence collected in 1988 but never properly cataloged. Thought you should see it. The video showed grainy security footage from a gas station 5 miles from the Kozlov home on the night of the murders. The timestamp read 11:17 p.m., July 24, 1988. A teenage Richard Thompson could be seen entering the store, his clothes clean, showing no signs of the violence that had occurred at the Kozlov home. He purchased a bus ticket from the store clerk, who also sold regional bus tickets, and made a brief phone call from the payphone outside. This footage definitively proved what Richard had claimed in his final moments. He hadn't been at the Kozlov home during the murders. The video had been misfiled for decades, only discovered during a digitization project of old evidence. Morris forwarded the footage to Sophia's prison email account with a simple message: "I think you needed to see this. Some truths come too late, but they come nonetheless." That night, in her cell, Sophia watched the footage repeatedly, studying the movements of the teenage boy she had spent most of her life hating. In his anxious mannerisms, she could see echoes of the man she would later work alongside for 3 years. There was fear in his eyes, but not guilt. The difference was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent years studying human behavior. For the first time in 40 years, Natasha Kozlov allowed herself to fully grieve, not just for her murdered family, but for Richard Thompson, the frightened teenager who had tried to help her and paid the ultimate price for his association with her family. And finally, she grieved for herself, for the decades spent nurturing hatred instead of healing, for the life that might have been if she had channeled her remarkable determination toward creation rather than destruction. In her journal that night, she wrote what would become her final entry about Richard Thornton. The truth arrives in fragments, over decades, never complete enough to fully heal but sufficient to show how thoroughly I misunderstood. My revenge consumed not only Richard's life but my own. I wonder if, somewhere beyond understanding, he has found the peace that eluded him in life, the absolution he sought for a crime he didn't commit. As for me, I continue the hard work of building something from the ruins of 2 lives destroyed by a single night of violence 40 years ago. Not vengeance. Not atonement. Just the quiet, imperfect process of becoming human again.